The following program is part 2 of 2 parts, each part an hour long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time that other lectures in the series will be shown.
I find that for quite a lot of my stuff I have to use bird netting, and people need to be aware that birds can create very, very serious problems. I've lost entire set of lettuce transplants, for instance. Put out little lettuce seedlings in the morning, figure, well, I'll get the protection over them at the end of the afternoon. Well, the birds got there before I did. So that with some crops I find it's absolutely necessary to keep nets on essentially almost all the time. Nowadays, that picture was taken a few years ago. Nowadays I tend to use the floating row cover for this purpose. It gives some other advantages. Now we'll get to just a couple of thoughts about irrigation. Again, I know you've had a whole discussion on irrigation, but I feel I just want to emphasize or re-emphasize a couple of points. And the first one then is the amount of water that is used by crops. This is assuming, these sort of figures are assuming that you have essentially a continuous canopy. So that it would be, a solid planting of corn or a lawn or something like that. Obviously, if you've got bare areas in between, the numbers begin to change. Initially, if the soil is wet in bare areas, you've actually got a lot of evaporation occurring. But once the soil surface begins to dry, then the numbers begin to fall off a bit if you don't have the solid canopy. But in the wintertime, obviously, it varies from nothing to pretty low. Nothing when it's raining and high humidity. On a sunny day in the middle of January or February, we can get a little bit of demand for water. This time of the year, in the Central Valley, we can range from not much. I mean, today would be a good example of not much. In fact, today probably is a 0 day in terms of water demand. Actually, an interesting aside, we had half an inch of rain at Davis before I left this morning. And I got up here, it looked like you hadn't had any yet, or it was just starting. And you've got to reckon that, we could easily be looking at 1/10 of an inch a day, maybe a little bit more than that at this time of the year. Get a strong north wind blowing. Humidity goes way down. We've seen evaporation go up into the region of about half an inch by mid-April. Now, if you think about it, you've got a crop out there, and you've got a half-inch demand of water on it. Many soils are only going to give you 1 to 2 inches of available water, so that you'd better be ready if we get these strong north wind days. Be advised that you may have to really get on and do some watering. In the summertime in the Central Valley, got to reckon on somewhere around 2/10 to 1/4 of an inch a day on average. That means that if you've got a water holding capacity in the soil of around or available water of an inch, inch and a half, you're going to have to irrigate about every 4 to 6 days. And again, it can go much higher than that, and you've got to be cognizant of the fact that you can get these really drying days that just suck the water out of plants. So then the question in this climate is how much, when, and how do you do it? I feel that one should never apply less than 1 inch to 1 1/4 inches of moisture. I'm going to have a slide in a minute that will say this same point. Hose end watering by hand is really not the way to water a vegetable garden. You just do not put down the required amount of water. And if you do, it comes down in one great big slug and tends to just pond on the soil surface. Now, that depends a bit on the soil type. People who are on sandy soils are going to have to irrigate, probably a little more often than people who are on heavy clay soils because of the difference in water holding capacity. I feel that if you're working with sprinklers, you can actually measure that fairly easily. You can actually go out with a coffee cans or something and put them under the sprinklers and see how much water you're getting. If you're dealing with irrigation in furrows, then you're going to have to do some calculation probably of flow rates and gallons per minute and area being watered and this type of thing. It actually gets a little bit more complicated, but it's certainly not really that difficult to do. However, as I said, I keep talking about drip irrigation, and I found the only real way to do that is to actually do some experimental trial and error in your soil and see what works well for the plants. So that, you know, recognizing that we have to do some irrigation, the least cost is furrow. Just take a hose, bubbler on the end of it, and let the water run down the furrow. This is what most of our growers do, except they do it with siphon tubes, and they just siphon water out of a ditch and let it run down the furrow. It's definitely the cheapest way. However, it's really, I don't think, the best way. You can use sprinklers. There's a little bit of a problem with sprinklers. If you're going to do over vegetables, do it at night. Don't use sprinklers during the daytime. Preferably about 6 o'clock in the morning, 5 or 6, 4, 5 a.m., something like that. The reason for that is the plants are usually wet from dew at that time, and the sprinkler is just going to sort of reinforce that moisture. The problem with, one of the major problems with sprinkling is you get the foliage wet, and if the foliage stays wet for a long period of time, you're setting yourself up for diseases. And so that this is why I say sprinkling should always be done really ideally in the early morning. Drip irrigation solves that problem because you really don't get water up on the foliage, and very often the drip actually may be buried. There are really two ways you can do it. You can go with, you know, this sort of spaghetti tube with emitters on the end of it, and my feeling with that is that's for the birds. It really is not the way to go about this for vegetable gardening. It's this stuff called T-tape with what are called spin lock connectors that really make drip irrigation work. This is how I used to sprinkle things. I'd have these metal risers with just a rainbird sprinkler head up on top of it and throw it out over everything. But they're all on automatic timers, so they were coming on at this 2 a.m. type of timing. Yeah. I'm going to cover that in a minute. Most people are not familiar with it. Somebody asked me about leaky hose. That's sort of leaky hose with too much pressure on it. But I went through this routine. I mean, it would happen to be at line pressure. This was, and that was way too much for leaky pipe to really work well. Problem I've had with leaky pipe is that within about 2 months in the summer, it starts plugging up. And after about 2 to 3 months, you've got to replace it. Otherwise, you're just not getting water. And I'm just not having that problem with the T-tape at all. So what are we talking about then with T-tape? What we're talking about is just regular half-inch polyethylene headers, and this is the T-tape coming off along the crop row, and you can see the water leaking out and forming the wet spots. Now we're looking then, this is the header, the regular half-inch polyethylene header pipe. This is what really makes it work, is these things called spin lock connectors. There are some other names that some of the catalogs use, but the idea is always the same. So this is the tape out here. One more picture. This is again, so that all you do is you punch a hole in the header pipe where you want to run a line of irrigation, and you can literally then just plug the barbed spin lock connector right into that. And this you can see has got a sort of a knurled end on it. And again, if you've never seen this stuff, I mean, you can come up at the break and have a look at it. But this is just a short piece of it. It comes in a flat roll. This is actually very thick T-tape. I personally buy the thickest that I can get because it lasts for many years. Commercially, they go to much thinner tapes in many situations. But this device on the end is what I'm talking about, and literally it is just twisted on. And now I've just removed it from the end. And you can just put these things, all you got to do is just put it on. And there's actually a trick to that. I brought some of my supplies. This is just a piece of old sandpaper. Because getting the pipe to slide onto the connector is sometimes a little tricky. And I find that just holding it with the piece of the sandpaper has slid it right onto the barbs. And all you've got to do now is just twist that back down and lock it. That's all it takes to set one up. And I've puzzled as to why I don't run into the problems of clogging that I did with the leaky pipe type thing. But I think it's the fact that this tape actually just goes flat when there's nothing in it. And the water all leaks out. So you don't get the water left in it. The leaky pipe is a rigid pipe. And so that it always evaporates that much water in the pipe.
Now, by leaky pipe, do you mean that kind of hose that just is kind of...
Yeah. Yeah, soaker hose, right? See, this stuff, and again, you can see it when you come. This has a rather specialized type of little orifice built into the plastic wall. It's got a little sort of orifice built into the wall, and it's got what they call turbulent flow behind it, which seems to help work stuff through it or something. And when you come up and look at it, you can see there's a little hole right here. This is an 8-inch spacing tape. So there's another one 8 inches up here, another one 8 inches down here. And now that's what you can see in the picture I showed you with the corn. That's why it had the sort of spots of water, is because that's where the emitters were. And I find the 8-inch spacing is fine for vegetable garden. The commercial name is T-tape, and you can get it. I mean, the places that I buy it. I mean, you can get it from either one of those farm stores I talked about, Peaceful Valley or Harmony. Carry T-tape. They carry it in different weights of plastic. You can get little, relatively short pieces, maybe a couple 100 feet. For trial, I actually just went whole hog several years ago once I realized this stuff really worked, and I just bought 4,000-foot drum. And I probably won't have to buy any more. It cost $120, and it's going it'll last me my lifetime, I think. I'm not sure. I'll answer you I'll get to you. The question was, do I leave it out in the garden all the time? The answer is actually no. At the end of the season, once a particular crop is gone, I actually just pull these out of the headers and store them. And that's it, all 10-foot lengths now, because everything is done on 10 feet. And this is part of the reason why. Put a goof plug in to the header, so you can go on using the lines for things that need the water, but you're no longer watering where you don't need it. Depending on the crop, sometimes I bury it, sometimes it goes on the surface. I've got tapes now that I've had in more or less continuous use on and off with crops for about 8 years, still going. The only time I lose tapes, basically, occasionally they'll plug up. But in most of the time, the reason I lose tapes is because I get a little ambitious when I'm harvesting something and I'll cut it. Or I'll stick a fork in it or something like that. Yes.
It says spacings on that T-tape. Yours there is 8 inches. It comes
You can,
shorter,
no, I haven't seen any that go closer than 8. You can go further. There's 12s and 16s. One of the things that got me onto this is that some of our very big vegetable growers in the Salinas Valley are shifting over to this stuff. And when you see a guy who's growing several thousand acres lettuce, and they figure this is working for them, I said it's time I had a look at it too. And as far as I was concerned, it was a real revolution, because it's cut my water use, I reckon, by 50%. And not only that, with a couple more tricks I'm going to give you, it actually makes the plants grow better too.
Could you pass that around?
Yeah, we can pass it around. Question up front was, how do you close it off? Because it comes on this big roll, and you just take a knife or a pair of scissors or cut it. I actually went through, and nobody told me this. I actually bought things you could attach to the end with, you know, caps on them. In actual fact, what this has is just a piece of the tape itself. That's all that I pulled off. And you just fold it over twice. You just crimp it back on itself like so. And then you sort of squeeze it up a bit. And there you see, I just sealed up the end. Yeah, we can hand it around. One of the things that you particularly need if you're using this stuff is make sure that you've got clean water. And you know, I did remember to pick, I've got a spare one of these. I run mine, all mine go through these type of Y filters. And there's another trick, I mean, these have got a pretty fine stainless steel screen in them. One of the things I struggled with a bit was how do I get fertilizer out to these crops now, particularly side dress nitrogen. What I'm holding here is my real high-tech nitrogen supply device. That's 2 film canisters. I cut the end off one of them and they've been taped with just electrical tape together. And you probably can't see it, but I just popped the end off there. That's been drilled out with a very fine drill. It's just got a lot of little holes in it. Same at the other end. Again, you can come and see these. I just put some urea in here, and you noticed it fitted, happens to very conveniently fit inside the stainless steel filter, so that I just literally mainline these guys. When the water comes on, you get a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer goes out. I reckon I've cut my nitrogen use about probably 4-fold compared with sprinkling side dressing stuff out. And I just do this every watering or every other watering. I just go around to the filters and just spin them off, and it's a good time to check whether they're clean too, and just pour a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer in this thing and pop it back in, put it back together. And that's the supply has been has really the growth of the plants has really been fantastic. The other thing I was going to show, I also, as a recommendation now, I do it myself all the time. Before I install a new tape for a particular row of plants, particularly if I'm going to bury it, I actually put it on and test it. I actually run I've actually just plugged one of these connectors. The connector I've got here, and you can come and look at it, there's 2 kinds. The ones I'm sending around is the cheap one. It's about 30 cents for each one of those little connectors. This one has a little tap built into it, so you can actually turn the line on and off. But they cost about $1.25 or $1.50, so they're quite a bit more expensive. If you damage the tape and you really don't want to remove it, you can get double-ended connectors that'll connect 2 pieces of tape together. In other words, if you cut it or make a hole in it, you can actually just stick one of those in and get back in production again. Yeah.
Are there on the aided spacing on the flow layers, are those rated for a certain flow rate, or you use your reducer? What do you use to
You've actually just jumped my next point. The actual flow rate, of course, is determined by the pressure. There's no real difference in what you can buy. You can't buy different flow rate emitters. Maybe different companies. There are now some other companies starting to make this stuff. But basically, you have to bring the pressure down to between 10 and 20 psi. And the one I've got here is the one that I put on the end of my hose when I just want to run a few lines by hand, so to speak, rather than running it off the fully automatic system that runs off the polyethylene headers.
But at 10 to 20, at that pressure,
In the catalogs, it will tell you how much water you get per 100 feet of drip tape, I think, if I remember rightly. It's done that way. I find that with my heavy soil, I run my drip tapes about 4 hours every 4 days. But it's the sort of thing that you would have to play around with a bit to find out just what is the ideal for the soil type you're on. Yeah, I'm sure if you're on a sandy soil, my guess is perhaps you'd be wanting to do 2 or 3 hours every 3rd day or something like that. I've run them as infrequently as once a week. But that I find that things tend to get a little bit dry if I let them go that long. That's just a rather poor slide to remind me that you need a pressure reducer and a filter. Both of them are on there. I think that's a 15 psi pressure reducer on there. That's just a picture of them laid out, irrigating a bit of land before I tilled it. The floating row covers, that's this stuff. There are several reasons that one should think about using this stuff. It modifies all of these parameters. In fact, we had a frost 4 days ago, nipped the top of my potato plants. I've found that the floating row cover like this will give me about 3 to 4 degrees of frost protection. So that something, potatoes underneath this will probably tolerate 28 degrees, something like that, which normally would really do quite a bit of damage. In the all the drier times of the year, we get a little bit of an increase in humidity under there, which can be really quite beneficial. I was very hesitant about using this stuff in the middle of the summer when I first started using it. And it was somebody in the Master Gardener program in Santa Rosa when I was over there doing one of these type of sessions several years ago now, who said, oh, I've been using it in the summer every year, right through the middle of summer. Use it in the middle of the summer as well. Works fine. And I think one of the reasons it's useful too is it tends to diffuse the sunlight a bit, so you don't get the burn type on sensitive plants that you do if they're directly exposed to the sun. It gives you insect protection for any of the flying type organisms, provided it's sealed down. It must be sealed down, otherwise they can get in. But obviously it doesn't help with soil-borne things very much. But keeping off cabbage butterflies, for instance, works very, very well. Problem was, one time I sealed a cabbage butterfly underneath. And I think you probably get the message. Not a good idea. And because when you've got the floating row cover down, you really can't see the plants underneath very much. And so I didn't even see what was happening. And I lifted it off a couple of weeks later and oops. Little hard to see here, but there's a row of seedlings here. I find this stuff is very helpful for getting stuff up in the middle of the summer. Remember I said about carrots, trying to get carrots started using the pre-germination idea. I found that by putting the floating row cover up, and I'm actually supporting it here, it's not floating, and there's a point there. I found that many kinds of, although it's advertised and sort of sold with the idea that it's light enough, you can just drape it over the top of the plants and let the plants support it. I found that if you get much wind and it's wet at the same time, you can do quite a lot of damage to the plants underneath. So most of the time I actually support it on something. This is one of the ways I support it. Just pieces of relatively cheap fencing material, just cut into about 3 foot lengths, and they form, all you got to do is just cut it off the roll and you've got a nice arch. And just stand about 3 or 4 of these down the row and you've got your protection. Much easier to use than single wire hoops. And you can see carrots coming up under here. This is in the middle of August. And there's beets on the other side. What I did in this case was to just go in under once a day. I would actually go in with a fogging nozzle on the end of my hose and literally just fog the soil so that I didn't really crust it. And you can see that after doing this for about 7 days underneath the cover, I was getting very, very good emergence. Nowadays I would actually have a drip tape down there. This was done before I switched to drip tape. That's the same row. Probably end in the middle of November or something like that. This is a similar sort of idea. I also have what I call chicken wire cloches. Anybody know what cloches are? Anybody who's read a bit about English or European gardening probably knows what cloches are. They're actually little mini greenhouses. They're made out of 3 pieces of glass so that you'd have 2 pieces on the side and a piece on top. And they're probably about this sort of length, typically with wires holding them together. Well, I haven't found much reason to use that type of thing, but I've got essentially the same idea but made out of pieces of chicken wire, which I use for keeping birds out, cats out, and as a support for the floating row cover. But this again is beets, probably about the end of February one year, and you can see the drip tape lines going down, which would be used if I think the moisture is getting a bit low. I'd just turn them on for probably just 5 or 10 minutes when you're just trying to use them for germinating stuff. You don't need it to run very long. There again, floating row cover. I grow essentially all my lettuces are grown under the floating row cover all times of the year. The one that I showed you, that lettuce I held up at the beginning, it came out, it's underneath floating row covers. One of the things that I found I can do, I used to grow lettuce into the fall, still do, planting direct seeding probably about mid-September. This means you're sort of just getting lettuce by about the end of November, about when it starts cooling down. By putting floating row covers over these things, I find I can harvest fresh lettuce right the way through the winter in the valley. I actually harvest from about beginning of December and clear until about the middle of February off this one sowing made in the middle of September. But the floating row cover is really what makes it work. Some cautions I've already mentioned in a way. One, if it's not sealed, you get things underneath it. You're also creating an ideal environment for weeds. So be warned that they grow well under there too. It will let water through. And if it's flat, it will go through fairly well. But if it's domed up and over anything, it tends to run most of the water off. So that there is a problem getting water underneath it unless you're using the drip tape. So that, some of this is all part of an evolving system. That you can use, your floating row cover works well. The plastic weed mat works well. Takes the drip tape to sort of make the whole system operate. You've probably had a chance at this point to read my statement there. I feel that most things that you buy as garden supports are really not intended for serious gardeners, or they're intended to frustrate you or something. Poles and strings work, take a lot of time. Don't use them very much now. I used to. I'll make a comment about these homemade horizontal trellis for scrambling plants. I used the lightweight garden fencing, I think, make excellent cylinders for some sort of lighter type supports. But if you really want heavy duty support, which there are a number of plants that do that, then concrete reinforcing mesh is really the way to go. I mean, you can buy a roll of this stuff. It's 5 feet wide and 50 feet long and longer, relatively cheaply, and it lasts essentially forever. And you do need these things called T-posts to hold it up, but they essentially last forever too. So for about probably a $30 or $40 investment or something like that, you've got supports that really work. That is the Alderman P the one that I'm talking about, in basically all its glory, just before I'd start harvesting it a number of years ago, because it's got string in it. This was just to put in. You can make various kinds of string and post type thing, but pretty laborious. This is the horizontal trellis idea I was talking about. This was a few years ago, and I've sort of formalized this a bit more. But the way I grow tomatoes is to just let them scramble up through the supports. What I do now is it's 4.5 feet wide and 10 feet long. I've standardized my frame. 4.5 feet, I can reach in from each side and just about get the fruit. There might be one or two right in the middle that are a bit of a struggle. But you don't want to make the thing wider than you can reach in. My tomatoes I grow are all non-determinate varieties. Always are going to be something like 8 to 10 feet high at the end of the summer. The frame only goes up to about 7. And that's how it, basically it's just held together very, very simply with bits of tie wire. Tie wire is what is used on rebar. Where rebar crosses when they're doing building construction, they put a piece of wire around to hold it in place. I do exactly the same thing on the wooden frame. Takes a little while to build this thing, but I have not come up with a system that I think is better. I've tried fiddling around with other ways of doing it, and I still come back to using this approach. That's not a real good picture, but I think you can see that there's these lightweight fencing. It's in a cylinder about that diameter, and again there's a couple of T-posts holding it up, and I use it mainly for flowers. That was sweet peas, and they're sort of past their best at that point, but you get the idea. I have not. And it's something that I contemplate playing around with, but the way I grow tomatoes, I'm not sure it would make much difference, because within about 3 weeks of putting the plants out, I've got this great mass of foliage, and there's no light coming down to the ground anyway. So the answer is no. I think when you're dealing with a row crop, growing it in rows, and you're dealing with a bush type variety where you've always got light getting down to the ground, there may be something in it. But when you're growing these big non-determinate varieties, I'm not sure what one would get from it. I certainly haven't played with it. This is just showing you, if you're not familiar with what I mean by the 6x6 reinforcing mesh, that's it. That's a 6x6 inch spacing. And you can see beans, you don't have to tell beans about it. They'll find it, and away they go. Cucumbers, not quite as good. You have to give them a little bit of instruction. And by that, I actually mean about every 3 days, I walk along each side of the row and say, okay, you're through that side today. You're through that side. You just keep posting them back and forth. And the tendrils they've got help, but they won't go up it by themselves. But it gives you really a heavy-duty support. I don't have photographs of this, but I'm now starting to grow things like cantaloupes, Crenshaws, these types of things. I'm growing up on this type of a frame because you get so much production per unit area. With the heavier fruits, you've got to support them. And I'm finding that the easiest way of doing that is if you've got bird net like I do to keep birds off. There's a piece of bird net. That actually makes a pretty good support for melons. I just get a hook and just hook it up into the metal, the metal, you've got the reinforcing mesh there, and just the plant, just sit the melon inside this stuff. Yeah. The question if I use nylon pantyhose for support, the answer is yes. That wasn't one of the ones I said, no, I haven't tried it. Yes, I have. They work. It's more of a hassle, though, than using this stuff. And I found that if you get a lot of sun on it, for a period of several weeks, they begin to break down. The nylon, you begin to get a the typical loss of strength of the plastic. Whereas this stuff is, it's black plastic and it's designed to be put out in the sun, and it lasts several years. So you get nice straight cucumbers if you grow it up that way. I've cut mine at 6 feet pieces. So it's a 5 foot wide, it comes on a 5 foot wide roll, 6 feet high is what I have. And it would, typically I'll have it about 6 inches off the ground. I use 8 foot T-posts for it. And it gives you, I can put up probably a 10 foot section would take 2.5 of these to 3 T-posts and wire it up in place. And probably takes about half an hour, and you've got a support that really is a support. There it is set up for the peas. It also shows that when you've got these big T-posts and I've got bird netting hung all over it too, because these pea varieties, if I don't protect them, the birds will just eat them right into the ground. So they're protected all the time. Again, I mentioned my chicken wire cloches. That's chicken wire cloches, again, keeping the birds off the young. to peas before I get the big system set up. Transplanting, there's some reasons why people should consider, or one might want to consider transplanting. The reason I say save space is because you don't have to grow things spread out at initially at the density you want them. You can grow them compact, then you transplant them out to the bigger spacing. You can certainly get more crops. Takes less time. If you've got plants you're putting out rather than seeds. You tend to get away from stand problems completely. Occasionally, obviously, transplants die on you, but they're generally more foolproof. In some crops, I think you actually end up with a lot of the cold crops. If you transplant them, you'll actually get better vigor than if you direct seed them. And certainly you get away from germination problems in the soil. You may have some in whatever you're growing them in initially, but typically I'm going to be starting plants in some sort of a soil mix, and so that you get much better germination than if you do direct seeding. But probably these are the two major reasons. You can get plant more accurately. You've got to grow them yourself in order to get them at the right time. And to get the variety you want, it may mean you're going to have to grow them yourself. Quality, I find, commercial stuff that you get is very variable in quality. Depends a bit whether you happen to get into the store the day after the truck brought everything in, or if it's been sitting there for 10 days being watered by somebody who doesn't know what he's doing. Some crops, I think you can routinely transplant. It works extremely well. Things like tomatoes and peppers, cole crops, lettuces, onions, all these transplant very well. There are a whole lot of crops that one should not even think about transplanting. Basically, the root crops just don't even consider it. When you transplant, you damage the roots. And if you're trying to grow a root crop, you almost inevitably damage the root. There was somebody got the bright idea a few years ago that we could grow sugar beets. We used to grow a lot of sugar beets in the Central Valley. We don't anymore because the factories have just closed down. But somebody got the bright idea that we could grow sugar beets from transplants. Well, the root gets damaged, and you got these most horrendous looking sugar beets coming out at the end of the season. Same thing is true with a garden crop. So root crops, carrots, beets, turnips, none of these things should even think about it. I see cucurbits being transplanted. They can be transplanted. They don't really like being transplanted. Oh, sorry, all the squash, cucumbers, these type of plants, melons, they will transplant, but you do some root damage. They don't really like being transplanted. Beans and peas are much the same. Beans particularly don't transplant well. You can do it. Parsnips are a root crop again, and perhaps should have been up with this list because they're the same problem. Starting transplants, what do you start them in? You can certainly go to the sort of cheap route and you reuse something like that. My advice is you can get peat pots. My advice is don't use them. And I'd be interested. Anybody use peat pots and like them? Yeah, I've asked that question to many master gardener audiences. I've never had anybody say they really like peat pots. My experience is the problem is the roots tend to stay in the peat pot for some reason. And so you get very poor rooting. And yet you can buy them in almost any of the sort of gardening catalogs. So as advice to people, don't use peat pots. I have no experience with these things. I see them advertised devices you can make soil blocks. I really don't know. I think you probably are all familiar with that type of thing. That's the commercial 6-packs. I've got several thousand of those. Again, they're relatively cheap when you buy them by the cartonful. And I thought at the time that was really the way to go. However, I've almost stopped using them. This is my current device that I like for planting stuff in. This particular one, I think, is about 6 or 7 years old. I clean them up with chlorine solution so that I don't carry pathogens from one time to the next. I just literally spray them with commercial bleach and then make sure they sit out for about a day before they get reused to make sure all the chlorine is dissipated. Either one of those garden store catalogs have them. Yeah, you don't get them from the typical commercial seed houses, and yeah, obviously large part. I mean, I keep a supply of these sort of things for doing some things, but that's pretty expensive of soil supplies when you've got 4-inch pots. Whereas these things, I just find they work extremely well. I've got different sizes and configurations, but they're all that overall size. There's just an example of a couple of different cell sizes and also depth of tray. But yeah, that's what you get out of them. Now that, I must admit, is a commercial grower. And generally I don't get them looking as neat as that. But that's the idea. But that's what, again, when you see a commercial house, I mean, this is commercial production. If the commercial guys are using these things, there must be something right about them. They don't use peat pots. What do you put in them? I would always advise against soil. I don't care where you're getting it from. It's got pathogens in it almost for sure. It may have enough clay in it, it compacts. There are problems. I've used this sort of very basic, you might call UC mix sometimes, just using a peat sand soil. Still got soil in it. It works reasonably well. But you can use commercially available mixes. I feel that's a very expensive way of getting a medium for your plants. My current choice is this 50% peat and 50% perlite. And if you're not familiar with what something like that looks like, I actually brought a bag full of this stuff here, and it sort of looks like that. But you can buy a big bag of perlite and a big bag of peat, and you've got $20 out, and that'll keep you going for several years, unless you are very ambitious. Point there, I do want to emphasize that. This is basically sterile. I mean, there's nothing in it. It doesn't have any nutrients either. So be aware that your plants are going to need a complete nutrient type supply right from the word go. If you're going to pot them on, and I do some of this, again, you can use whatever you were starting in. This is my current one. I take this same mixture, but just now put 50% redwood into it. And there's a bag of that too. Commercial guys, people like Heinz Nursery, that big nursery that's over just out in the hills just past Vacaville on the south side of the freeway. Everything they're growing is in that. They just use a redwood sawdust and sand. For commercial people as a consideration, they don't want anything that will degrade. They have to grow those plants for about 2 years in the big commercial nursery. They're growing trees and shrubs. If it burns, if it quote burns off, it's got a lot of peat in it, it's going to go down, and the pot's half empty by the time they get around to selling it. But I find this works pretty well. One of the questions that's come up in previous years when I've done this is, what about cocoa husk? Can we get away from using peat? Because peat moss, particularly sphagnum peat, is something that we are using up probably at a greater rate than it's being formed. We being human beings. I'm currently in the process of playing around with using the cocoa fiber in place of the sphagnum, and I am not entirely convinced it's giving me as good a results. Has anybody tried using the cocoa fiber for starting plants like this?
It's not as good as the sphagnum.
Some more confirmation, not as good as the sphagnum. That's my analysis at this point, and I've only grown two cycles of planting material in it. I'm getting, exactly, I seem to be getting more root problems. It's not as well aerated, I don't think. We're almost through. One of the things in the summer, and you're trying to get cool season plants up in the middle of the summer, I've just said you've got to grow these cabbages, the lettuces, all these things long enough to get the thing, but it means getting them up in July and August. I started out using bits of old gunny sack as shade. If they're in the sun directly, most of these cool season plants will sunburn, literally cook at the soil line. I learned that the hard way when I first moved here. Brussels sprouts, coming up in, I think, early August, went out in the morning, and a nice line of little Brussels sprouts just beginning to show, came back in the evening, and they were all dead. All of them. And it looked like damping off casually, because at the soil line you've got all this pinched off damaged tissue, but it's actually just heat damage. So that what you have to do, you've got to protect them from direct sunlight until they get established. I have now gone, you can't really see what that is, but again I've brought a piece. This is 50% shade cloth. And I put it on these little, it's stapled onto little bits of redwood. I can just stick these in on the south side of the row, and now the plants are getting 50% sunlight rather than 100%, and it works very well. When I transplant things in the summer, those are Brussels sprouts, I give them a little bit of shade on the south side. This must have been photographed perhaps at 10 o'clock in the morning because the sun hasn't come around, but rest assured those plants would be shaded during the middle of the peak of the sunlight in the summer. I also find that the floating row cover really helps a lot. As I said, diffuses sunlight, get a lot less sunburn. So now actually I do a combination of floating row cover and shade cloth for a lot of these sensitive plants. There's I've just put the floating row cover on the south side of these plants and left them open on the north side. A couple of thoughts, a little bit off. As I teach, as Lynn alluded to, I teach in the graduate pest management program. I also teach undergraduate pest management. Always want to make the core point that you must identify the pests before you start trying to do a control strategy. If you get the pest ID wrong, then everything else goes wrong. Damaged peas. What's eating them? Yeah, well, again, the symptoms here tell you, when you get little straight lines across them like that, you know that's not slugs, it's not some sort of an insect, they just don't do that. Birds do that by pecking at them with their beak. There's the culprit. Got caught in the net, that one did. Problem is, I'm too much of a softie, I let them go again. Again, just diagnosing problems. Anybody see a problem on that? It may be a little hard to see from, you see those? Those are actually eggs of the cabbage butterfly. And so that you know, if you see those eggs appear, I mean, you'll probably see the butterflies around. Until you see the eggs appearing, there's no need to do anything, but soon after the eggs start appearing, you'd better be prepared for worms. There's it's on a bean plant, but that's the critter we're talking about. And this is just just saying that it doesn't matter how good you are at it, you get it wrong sometimes. This is a couple of my bad pictures now. I had these onions, and they're not they don't look right. So I guess they've run out of nitrogen. So I gave them a side dress of nitrogen and irrigated them, and they just got worse. They didn't get better. And at this point, it was already too late. At this point, I started, hey, I wonder if that's onion thrips. And sure enough, it was onion thrips just all over them. And they're a tiny little insect that you can only see it with a hand lens. So that I misdiagnosed it. And by the time it got to this point, I lived with the damage rather than tried to do anything about it. This was another one. These are rather sad-looking carrots. They'd been underneath floating row cover. This was a summer planting going into the fall, and I hadn't looked under the floating row cover for probably 2 or 3 weeks. I knew I'd got the plants up. the drip lines are running, so they're getting irrigated, and I just hadn't looked at them. And when I took the row cover off, whoa, there's a problem. Those plants all died. Essentially every one of them. That was the problem. That's the carrot root aphid. Had got in under, it's a soil insect. It crawls around in the soil. Got in under, loved the climate under there, and had just got onto every one of those plants. And by the time I saw it, it was too late to do anything. If you see it soon enough, you can treat it with malathion. And that's about the only thing I know that you can do with it. It'll probably work. That's my one weed control comment. I think most people let weeds get way too big before they start doing anything about it. So the sort of parting thought. And this is where you come in. You see, I'm imparting it to you, and then you're going to impart it to the general public, so that we have more gardeners and less fishermen or something. And I can try and answer questions about all these props I've been throwing around. This is the first point that I like to advise people to do. Keep records of what you do. I defy you, when you come back to planting season next year, to remember what variety was, what exact date you put things in. Record against things like when you planted against when you got harvests. Which things did well, which didn't. So I'm going through things. So planting dates, varieties that are being grown. Sometimes I go back to the catalogs, you can find out, or you've still got the seed packet or something like this. Particularly when a first harvest comes in. Over a period of years, this is going to show you really whether something is working properly or whether you can start moving dates around a bit. I keep a running record of the weather in my garden all the time, because this again helps you to correlate how the plants were growing with what was actually happening in the garden. This is the sort of your rotation scheme type idea, that you need to remember what was planted in what place, with the idea that you generally don't want to plant the same crop back in the same piece of ground year after year. If you're a photographer, it may be worth taking pictures of things. I certainly do that. And then, as I called it, special notes, and I give the example of row spacing. But these sort of things, but particularly the top ones, are the ones that I feel that one needs to do, particularly when you're getting started. Once you've been doing it for 10 years or something like this, then some of it becomes fairly automatic, and you remember it. The incorrect planting date with quite a lot of stuff, and I'll talk about what some of these are when we get to the individual crop, is really kills people immediately. If you plant many of the biennial crops, all the cabbage type crops, carrots, beets, at the wrong time, you essentially can be condemning them to not give you anything back, because they botanically will not perform if they're planted at the wrong time. I'll use just one example right now. I think it was about 4 years ago, I was in Capitol Nursery, and this was in January, and there was a guy buying Brussels sprouts. I said, "You're crazy. Why would you want to put Brussels sprouts out in January?" I mean, I feel the latest date that we can reasonably plant Brussels sprouts in the Central Valley is about the 3rd week in August. Anything later than that, they're not going to work. I've done it. I've tried it. I even won't believe myself sometimes. I get to the first week, 2nd week of September, right after Labor Day. I think there's still enough time. Forget it. It won't work. Question that often always comes up is how deep should I plant it? As a general rule, I would say plant it shallower than you think it should be. There's another way I put this too, is as a rule of thumb, if you don't know how deep to plant something, don't plant it any deeper than 2 to 3 times the diameter of the seed. That means if you've got a little small seed, it doesn't go very deep. With things like carrots are pretty small, quarter, half an inch. If you get them much deeper than half an inch, they're just not going to make it up. So beets, again, about half an inch. Tomatoes could go a little bit deeper, but half an inch is a pretty good rule of thumb there. Now, as you go to these bigger seeded plants, they have a lot more oomph, and so they can be planted quite a lot deeper. So that, recognizing that we have to do some irrigation, the least cost is furrow. Just take a hose, bubbler on the end of it, and let the water run down the furrow. This is what most of our growers do, except they do it with siphon tubes, and they just siphon water out of a ditch and let it run down the furrow. It's definitely the cheapest way. However, it's really, I don't think, the best way. You can use sprinklers. There's a little bit of a problem with sprinklers. If you're going to do over vegetables, do it at night. Don't use sprinklers during the daytime. Preferably about 6 o'clock in the morning, 5 or 6, 4, 5 a.m., something like that. The reason for that is the plants are usually wet from dew at that time, and the sprinkler is just going to sort of reinforce that moisture. The problem with, one of the major problems with sprinklers, you get the foliage wet, and if the foliage stays wet for a long period of time, you're setting yourself up for diseases. And so that this is why I say sprinkling should always be done really ideally in the early morning. Drip irrigation solves that problem because you really don't get water up on the foliage, and very often the drip actually may be buried. There are really 2 ways you can do it. You can go with this sort of spaghetti tube with emitters on the end of it, and my feeling with that is that's for the birds. It really is not the way to go about this for vegetable gardening. It's this stuff called T-tape with what are called spin lock connectors that really make drip irrigation work.
The preceding program was part 2 of 2 parts, each part an hour long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time that other lectures in the series will be shown.
It's the definitive guide to gardening, produced by the University of California. The California Master Gardener Handbook contains over 700 pages of in-depth information on topics such as soil, fertilizer and water management, plant propagation, weeds and pests, lawn care, landscape design, home vegetable gardening, and the wide variety of garden crops that are grown in the Golden State. The chapters in this handbook provide helpful information on selecting varieties, planting, growth cycles, pruning, irrigation, and harvesting. The California Master Gardener Handbook is available along with other gardening publications on the A&R Catalog website at anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu.